Good day, all, and welcome to another segment of Did You Know Southwestern Montana? I'm Wally Felt, along with my co-host Jeremy Crawford, and we cover the history of Dillon and southwestern Montana. Today, we are looking at two Dillon landmarks, the Metlen Hotel and the Andrus Hotel. Now, the Metlen Hotel was built in 1897 by Joseph Custer Metlen and opened officially February 11th, 1898. Now, we just got rid of February here, not a typical February by any means, so it's kind of an anniversary type that we're talking about, the Metlen being formally built. Original construction was roughly $30,000. Now, in today's value, that's about $971,000, $917 and 90 cents. And I guess those figures kind of just threw me away. And I'm going to start over again. I did it so good the first time.
I know, that's why I feel so bad about it.
Oh, don't feel bad.
That's like when that one camera started flashing. It did it that one time too, and we did the other one. I was like, we've got such a smooth flow. I'll just say, I'll wait till we do the break. And
okay.
What I'm thinking is almost the plug-in might not be as tight as it needs to be because this one's not having any problems.
Now. Okay, so this is, what, take 4?
4 or 5.
Take 4 or 5. 3, 2, 1. Good day, folks, and welcome to another episode of Did You Know Southwestern Montana? I'm Wally Felt, my co-host Jeremy Crawford, and today we are looking at a couple of Dillon landmarks, the Metlen Hotel and the Andrus Hotel. Now, the Metlen was built in 1897 by Joseph Custer Metlen. He was one of the very, very successful ranching, business, political families, the Metlens, in early days of Dillon. It opened officially February 11th, 1898, and the original construction cost was roughly $30,000. That was in 1897. $30,000 of 1897 money is worth about $971,917.91. So either way you look at it, a nice chunk of change.
You think with today's inflation they could build it for $971,000?
Maybe the first floor. maybe just the brick around the outside. It was built on the same location of Dillon's very first hotel, the Kareen Hotel, and we were doing a little off-camera talking about the Kareen. The Kareen name popped up in the Andrus portion of our story, too. Now, the Kareen Hotel, at the time it burned down in 1891, was also owned by Metlen. He had bought it 6 years prior to that, and in the Dillon Tribune article about the fire titled "Gone Up in a Smoke," the reporter wrote what an excellent site the Kareen lots would make for a brick hotel. Now, one thing that I didn't really mention, there was a hotel, but there was also 2 or 3 side buildings that they also rented out, and Metlen owned all of them. And with the insurance money he got, he was able to move forward and start thinking about building a hotel. In fact, do you think he got sparked by that reporter who said...
Do you think that maybe that was the initial cause?
I'm thinking that was it. Now, the Kareen, as we backtrack a little bit and do a little history, wasn't actually your luxury palace. It was a 2-story frame structure with canvas partition walls on the interior. At least they're on the interior. They could be on the exterior. How would you like to take you and Haley doing a day trip to a hotel that the walls are partitioned canvas?
Could you imagine if your neighbor snored a little?
A little, yeah. Walking across the room would probably wake you up. But before we actually look at the Metlen, let's do a little history on the Kareen Hotel, because it has some interesting background history. It was born, in fact, they talked about the circumstances were quite humorous and provided entertainment to travelers in the early days of the Kareen Hotel. And me just telling Jeremy the story earlier in the day, he got a chuckle or two, which meant he was entertained by it. But it was born in Utah in the early days of the Utah and Northern Railroad. As the railroad construction slowly moved into the Northwest, an enterprising Pat O'Neill began construction of a modest structure in Round Valley, Idaho. And I'm thinking he maybe came from Kareen, Utah, because there was a town, Kareen, Utah.
There still is a town, Kareen, Utah. We found out.
And when completed, his little structure was a skimpy one-story structure, and he christened it the Kareen Hotel. Well, when it was time to move on, O'Neill would gather his friends, and then his friends and him would put the building on a flat car and move to the next terminus. Now, terminus, of course, is the railroad terminology for the end of the line where they moved to. Dillon was called terminus before the name Dillon was formally taken. At each stop, a bit more improvement was added to that structure, which I would have liked to have seen. Let's put 3 nails in this one and let's do this. And all along, and I'm thinking, we discovered the Kareen Trail. There was an actual destination place called the Kareen Trail. And we're going to be, and we probably shouldn't take, too much liberty with history, but we're going to take a guess that maybe part of the railroad was on the Kareen Trail heading into Montana. So from Round Valley, Idaho to Blackfoot to Beaver Canyon. Now I'm missing a couple of towns. I'm not naming them all. To Monida to Red Rock and finally to Dillon. That was the path the Kareen Hotel took getting here on a flat car.
And slowly grew as it got here.
Now in Dillon, O'Neill put it down, and he found a great location about 50 yards from the railroad. And I don't think they probably had a depot back in those early days, probably just where the train stopped. They might have had a tent or something there.
They probably had a platform, and you got on and off right there at the platform, and then you probably headed to the nearest buildings.
And so he said, I'm done traveling. And so he planted the Kareen Hotel, and he remodeled it into a 2-story building. Now, as we go back to the time, it burned down, and it burned down because of a plugged flue. But I found was interesting in some of the early, they talked about Christmas parties and political gatherings and whatnot in the 1880s and whatnot in Dillon. They had them at the Kareen Hotel. That was the place to stop. And I don't want to say party, but maybe socialize would be a better term. Now, that lasted until, like I said, 1891. The fire came. Now, all of a sudden, there's no hotel in Dillon.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny, too, because, probably how we're laughing about the Kareen having canvas walls, if you think about it, most people in Dillon that were staying there at that time were probably living in a canvas, like a miner's tent. It was probably more of a canvas miner's city than anything.
So maybe canvas was a little more luxurious than we're giving it credit for.
Exactly.
Well, so Dillon doesn't have a hotel. They've got a rooming house that was actually started by a lady who had been a maid at the Kareen Hotel, and she figured out the X's and O's of running a place like that, so she had a rooming house. But that was it.
Yeah.
That was it. Well, a couple of Dillon businessmen came up with an idea to replace the Kareen Hotel with the Hotel Dillon. And I'm talking about Leonard Elio. He was one of the 3 Elio brothers that helped settle Dillon, and J.E. Morse. They donated land at the corner of Idaho and Center Street, which from our location is just right down the street.
Yeah, just basically right beside us here.
It's where the African Oasis is right now. And the DI set up home in that building for many, many years. And they thought that would be a great place. They even hired an architect, and the architect designed plans for a 50 by 115-foot, 3-story brick building on a stone foundation. And maybe procrastination made the final decision for the Hotel Dillon, or maybe something else. Because I'm thinking that they waited maybe a little bit too long, and then the folks who owned the DI And I don't think that's the original location. I think the DI was in a barn or something like that. They were so successful, they wanted to have a little more permanent structure. And they might have offered Elio and Morse a little bit more cash because that was a solid offer. It wasn't a speculative offer.
Yeah, and another thing I was kind of thinking of, the building right over here where the Elks Lodge is, it actually has the Elio's brothers' name on it. So it could be that ground there where City Hall is located, and maybe they decided to build their own building on it.
We have to dig out your time machine and go back and find out exactly. But there was an article in the Dillon Tribune that talked about that. In fact, I had it close by that talked about the proposed hotel and whatnot. And I found really interesting and humorous the very last line in the in the article about the proposed hotel was, "The building will be practically fireproof."
Maybe they're taking off the fact that they learned their lessons from
the Kareen,
from burning down the Kareen.
Yeah, keep your flues clean. That might help out too. But no chimney sweeps probably around Dillon at that time. So the finished motel or Metlen Hotel, we're going to jump back up to the Metlen. When it was finished, a 3-story Second Empire style of roughly 42-room hotel, sitting on a granite stone foundation. The 32,000 square foot building itself was built with white quarry face sandstone, which I believe was from a quarry not very far away.
Yeah, I saw the name of the quarry. I don't remember it off the top of my head, and I kind of did some digging into that, but I wasn't really able to figure out where it was.
Well, and that white brick with intricate scrolling, and I'm not talking about the scrolling that appeared from somebody having one too many beers at the Metlen Hotel, pulling his pocket knife out and scrolling his name. Yeah. And it had a tin-covered roof. And that Second Empire style of architecture, you had mentioned to me off camera about that there's a couple of different homes in Dillon that actually subscribe to that very same form of architecture.
Yeah, if you head out on the old Butte Highway and you go north on the left-hand side as you're heading north, there's a farmhouse out there that literally is almost like a miniature version of the Metlen. It's got the little steeple and everything. And then even around town, as you're looking around town, there's a lot of houses that kind of have that same architect where it's the same boxy kind of build. I think in a way, a lot of the houses in Dillon, as some of the richer people started settling in Dillon, or the people that were poor and then made their money here in Dillon, I think they wanted to copy that architect.
Well, you figure when most of those homes were built, of the real classic homes were built in that era. So I'm thinking the Second Empire was the style of architecture that they used. Now, the interior finishing was, and it's still in great shape, was built from Michigan and Oregon pine. And I'm not sure why they didn't use Montana pine, but maybe the Michigan and Oregon just a little better for that type of construction. Whatever it was, Metlen didn't spare expenses for his new hotel. And one accessory, though, that didn't travel far from home was the back bar. Now, it's the back bar at the Metlen is one of my favorite places to go just to have a quiet, cool one.
Yeah, it's
a nice, quiet place. Well, get this now. So that 22-foot mahogany bar, work of art, wouldn't you say? The base is made entirely of oak. The bar top, remember now, 22 feet of mahogany. Guess how much the bar top alone weighs?
About 2 tons, I'm guessing.
You missed it by half a ton. A ton and a half. And it came from Bannock.
Yeah.
Nobody seems to really be able to pin down exactly where in Bannock it came from, but it came from Bannock. And, we fail a lot of times that Bannock was a happening place for many years, not just 2 or 3 years, for 30 years.
Yeah.
So it had all that pomp and circumstance and style and stuff. And I always like to throw Gus Grader into the mix because you and I have become a Gus Grader fan since we've been looking at all his achievements, and I'm wondering if he had anything to do with that coming from Bannock, because he was an early Bannock businessman.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if he didn't. It's kind of funny because, we think of like estate sales here where, somebody passes away and the kids come in and they break up the estate and sell it. Almost makes you wonder if that was kind of an early form back then, whereas, something might have been on the decline in Bannock. People knew that there was that, like take the bar, for instance, and then they knew of the hotel Metlen and Dillon. Grab it out of here and move it over there.
Well, and as much as that, the back bar is such an intricate and beautiful. It's not a bar top. It's a work of art.
Yeah,
it's a work of art. I love the signature 1-story tower. That's what I remember most about the Metlen, is that 1-story tower, which has a few ghost stories in it, which we'll talk about a little bit later on.
And that's just it too, is you got to think back then they didn't have, they carved that by hand. That was not something where they put it on a lathe that, was ran by a motor and, they could spin it and control the spin. That was somebody's labor of love right there to carve that.
Well, you and your dad like to do stuff like that. Just to guesstimate how in work time, in man hours, how long do you think it took the craftsman to do that?
Oh, I bet you it probably took him honestly, 6 months or more. They probably had those where there was, I don't know if there was an actual craftsman there in Bannock that did it, but probably for the more intricate stuff. I know just by, talking to some of the people at the churches and that, when they would build a church, they would bring people in from other parts of the world to do the carvings or the paintings in churches back then. So, that kind of gives you an idea. It was either something where there was somebody that carved it and then it was probably brought over, or somebody paid to have that carpenter come over and carve that bar top.
For a $10.50. Wow, that's interesting. Well, the Metlen had all the modern conveniences of an 1897 hotel. There was a call bell in every room. Jeremy, what's a call bell? I know, but I'm just testing you.
A call bell would be basically a string attached to a bell, and it would usually either run from the room, and some of them would run back to the room. And if you wanted room service, you would pull the string, and the bell would ring at a certain area, and it would have whatever room number it was on, then you'd know which room to go to. And then also they would have it where if you wanted to get up, instead of having an alarm clock, they would ring the bell, and then you would have to pull the string and ring the bell back so they knew you were awake.
The very first wake-up call. I don't know if I get woke, if that would...
the modern rooster.
Yeah, the modern rooster. Well, there's a call bell in every room. There was also electricity. Now, it says there was hot and cold running water, but in those early days of the Metlen, I don't believe the hot and cold running water was in the rooms as much as it may have been in the water closets, the bathrooms that were in the hall, because there's no mention of a bathroom in the hotel yet.
Yeah, and most of those rooms, I don't even think today a lot of those rooms have bathrooms in them. It was kind of back then you'd have a hallway full of rooms, and then there would probably be a sink in them if you were lucky. But then usually towards the end of the hall on both sides, they would have a couple bathrooms where you would bring your, you'd have a bedside pan that you would use that you'd fill with water and stuff. So that's how you'd clean yourself, or you would just go down and use those bathrooms. So I'm thinking originally it probably had hot and cold water, but I don't think it had it in every single room.
Well, the basement, remember this is 3, and they count the basement as a floor.
Yeah.
They count the basement as a floor. It had storage rooms, laundry rooms, heating plant. It also had living accommodations for the hotel help. The first floor contained an office, the main bar, a sample room, which I found interesting. You walk into the hotel and before you register, this is what our rooms look like.
Yeah.
So there was a lobby, of course, dining room, kitchen, and a barber shop. Now, the second floor was where the rooms were, the guest rooms, the bedrooms, however you want to describe them, and a ladies' parlor, which you had said most hotels had a ladies' parlor.
Yeah, the hotels had them, and also I've noticed in Butte they have the old depot, and every year they had a craft fair in there, and you'd go in there and there'd be the gentleman's parlor on one side and the ladies' parlor on the other. So what I'm thinking is, you'd be with your traveling companion or your wife and that, and then once you'd get to those areas, you'd want to go smoke a cigar, which, back then most women didn't smoke. If they did, it wasn't a cigar. So the guys would go in that area to smoke their cigars, and then the ladies would go into their parlor where they would probably, have tea or something. And then, and then that's how both people would unwind, basically.
Well, so we're back to the grand opening. I don't know if they called them a grand opening back. They called it. They introduced it to the town. They had ceremonies. They didn't have a grand opening. Yeah, Gala was a popular word back in those days. Over 200 guests attended this grand gala, including the current Montana governor R.B. Smith and Chief Justice Pemberton. Don't know what his first name was. Didn't list it in the newspaper article from 1898. They attended the formal openings. Now, early in the day, they had a ceremony for the general public, and the Dillon Brass Band played, and the number that they played was "There's Going to Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight." That's what they played. Well, just to show you Dillon these days is full of talented musicians, artists. Not any different back in those days either. They had enough for the Dillon Orchestra, which played in the more formal ceremonies that the governor actually spoke at. So they had a party.
They did, and it's kind of funny too, because these bands, I'm pretty sure, were pretty good size, and it seemed like there were bands for, there was a band on call for anything you need them to be like. It seemed like back then they were the DJs of their time.
Yes. Well, I know my great grandfather played in one of the bands. I think he played in the brass band. I've seen some pictures of him, and the typical, you look at the Music Man scenes and how the band is dressed up. That's how the Dillon Brass Band was dressed up. The Metlen went through a bit of remodeling from 1917 to 1918, one of which was the ability to have hot and cold running water in each room. So things were getting a little better. They also had a cabaret, and I'm wondering, if when we did the piece on movies and stuff like that, a lot of the early theaters had traveling acts that would come through Dillon. And I'm wondering, they only mentioned the theater, but you think that those same traveling acts, and maybe a little more high caliber ones, the ones that maybe cost a little more to bring to Dillon and stuff, maybe they performed at the Metlen Cabaret.
That's kind of what I was probably thinking, is that's what it was, is that they would bring in some higher class acts, just because some of the things we'll probably touch on later about the Metlen, was, they tried to keep up a very regal appearance. They had people stopping in that were either cowpokes on the trail, or they had cattle buyer that were coming through, to dignitaries. It's not like you think of now. Most people that probably come through the town of Dillon, they're just people passing through, just enjoying a family vacation. But during this time that the Metlen was really up and moving, the people stopping in there could have been dignitaries. They could have been senators, congressmen, because this was the place to stop along the railroads. So this was your overnight stay in that. So, they probably had to keep up a certain appearance with it to get those people to want to stay at their place. And also those people, word of mouth was advertising back then. So if somebody that's, rich and, to do of that time would say, well, I stayed at the Metlen, you need to stay there. Well, then that's how they got their guests.
Well, and as you mentioned, for many, many years, several decades, the Metlen was that luxury stop for travelers.
Yeah.
Some famous and some not so famous. We don't know who the famous ones were, but you mentioned the cowpoke who comes in from Horse Prairie, who's been out there for 3 months working and stuff, and he's got money in his pocket and he wants to live a little bit.
Yeah.
So he gets a room at the Metlen. It's the Metlen also, interesting enough, the Metlen's dining room hosted some grand affairs. One that I found was Judge J.B. Poindexter, and of course Poindexter, a very, very
well-known name
in our part of the world. He was going to Hawaii. He had been serving as a district judge in Dillon, and he was appointed to be a district judge in Hawaii. He later went on to be a territorial governor of Hawaii, and I believe his post, he held that post until 1942, so after World War II started. Well, they had a big soiree for him as a going away. I'm sure his relatives here were saying, see ya. He served as, I believe, the Dillon city attorney, district attorney, the district judge and stuff. So his roots in Dillon were pretty deep. So that was the place to go. The Metlen was also a polling place serving Dillon West, where during elections you could go vote. At other times you could go register to vote.
Yeah.
In 1935, veterans from Beaverhead, Madison, and Silverbow counties were guests of the Beaverhead post of the American Legion for an Armistice Day banquet at the Metlen Hotel. Now, at that very same time, the Legion Auxiliary held its annual banquet at the Andrus Hotel. Same time, same day, different place.
Yeah, and
people.
that just kind of shows you at one time Dillon was the place to be. I mean, you had two major hotels that were hosting, two big groups of people. So, now it seems like when something happens, we leave Dillon to go to it, where back then they were coming into Dillon. And the reason why probably was because we had the Metlen Hotel and we had the Andrus Hotel, and these were places that would draw these people to where, like these smaller outlying areas, they probably didn't even have a hotel or a banquet hall. Well, between the Metlen and the Andrus, that gave people a reason to come to Dillon. It gave them a place where they could come indoors, they could be catered to, they could stay there if they had too much to drink. This gave them the go-to meeting spot. And, little old town of Dillon at one time wasn't so little.
Yes. Well, one newspaper account, just to show you the number of people at one gathering, one Dillon Tribune account talked of a class reunion celebrated at the Metlen, commented that the dining room was decorated and ready to accommodate 70 guests. So there you have it. I mean, that's a pretty good function. Yeah. 70 guests is a pretty good function. Okay, now your favorite part of the Metlen is the ghost stories. 3 ghosts enter into the mix as being the more popular, and I think the one that most people think of when they think of the Metlen is the beautiful young woman in the light flowing dress who seems to hang out more in the dance floor or above the dance floor, and also, and I believe it's room 19, which is located directly above the dance floor.
Yeah.
And she doesn't do anything. She just kind of flows around. She's very friendly. She's not one of the mean ghosts that you hear about. She's a very friendly spirit. Just seems like she wants to be with you.
Yeah.
Doesn't really do anything except be there. And we were talking about stories where could she have she had evolved from, but that's never come out. She's just there.
And back then, if, like now if somebody dies, we want to know the cause. So we have autopsies and stuff, especially if it's a younger person. And back then, if you died, and there wasn't really much of a doctor to look over and figure out why. They just put down you died of natural causes. So, she could have had, some sort of flu, some sort of cold, appendicitis. There's all kinds of things that she could have had at that time that would have caused her death, or it could have just been somebody that was, you never know. She could have been murdered and it just was never caught. So, I mean, people came and went so much back then. We didn't have ways to track them like we do now.
Well, she obviously liked her stay at the Metlen because she has never left.
It left a lasting impression on her.
Yes. And then there's the male spirit that people, and once again, he's a friendly guy. He just appears, he likes to hang out in the bars, either the back bar or the main bar. And he seems to always be wearing a black hat and smoking a cigar. And people have said, I smelled the cigar.
Yeah.
I just didn't see it. I smelled it.
Yeah.
So you're wondering, is your imagination really running away from you, or is he really there? And then there's the third spirit that a lot of people talk about. And this spirit, they're not really sure if it's a male or a female. Nobody's ever seen it. They've only heard it.
Yeah.
And they've heard the spirit say, do you think they know we're dead? And that's it. And I guess I haven't heard it.
Nope, me neither.
And but it's been clearly heard by lots of people, and not just people who have been imbibing at the Metlen bar. I mean, this is in the middle of the day, and stuff that people have heard this. So more points to ponder. Now, the Metlen Hotel was officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places on December 13th, 1983. And it's kind of sad for me. I was thrilled to death when the Andrus Hotel went through all those renovations, and it became, the gentleman who did it tried to make it well, and he succeeded.
Yeah.
In making it back to its glory days.
Yeah.
And it'd be really nice if someone else, another benefactor, could come along and do the same thing at the Metlen Hotel. Because can you imagine the grandeur that it had in 1897 and into the 1920s and 30s and 40s when it was still a showplace?
Yeah. It would be neat to see that. The Andrus is back. The upper floors have all been remodeled. They still have the second and first floors businesses. Pioneer Furniture is in there, so they have the whole second floor. But, the Metlen right now is basically just a bar, and it's got the front bar and the back bar, and I don't even know if they rent any of the rooms in it.
Well, there's how many cafes have there been in that back corner cafe? I mean, there was a couple that were really good. The food was really, really good.
Yep.
But the people that opened those cafes, they tried to bring something different to Dillon.
Yeah.
And the Dillon people didn't truly accept it.
Yeah.
And so, you can't run a business when you don't have business.
Yeah.
So they all faded away, and you still see. I mean, there was a restaurant right before COVID hit. I walked by there once, and they had said cafe open.
Yeah.
And, of course, COVID, that destroyed that.
Yep.
But, it's like, we have two buildings in Dillon. We have the Orr Mansion, and we have the Metlen Hotel.
Yeah.
That would be really nice if some big benefactor would come along and take care of those guys and bring them back into their former glory, because they are signature places of Dillon.
Well, they're the landmarks of Dillon.
Landmarks,
they're
that's a better
things that
word,
make
yeah.
Dillon. I remember as a kid the Orr Mansion, and I think it was kind of then when I was younger that. The problem with the Orr Mansion is I could only imagine what the upkeep of that place would have been. And in this modern day and age, then you figure that in on top of it, and then you also figure in the years of nobody taking care of it. And, the Metlen's gone through a couple small remodels, but I think you'd have to find somebody that'd be willing to sink millions and millions of dollars into both of these places. And, with COVID and things like that, that's probably something you won't find. But it's also sad that Dillon's losing these historic landmarks to time.
Yes. Okay, that is part one of our feature on a couple of Dillon landmarks, the Metlen Hotel. We're going to take a little break right now, and then we're going to come back, and Jeremy's going to take over, and Andrus Hotel. next up on Did You Know, Southwestern Montana.
Stevens Floral would like to remind you Valentine's Day is Sunday, February 14th. Get your orders in early, as they will be open on the 14th for pickup only. All right, and now we are back, and I am going to talk about the Andrus Hotel and Harry E. Andrus. Harry Andrus and his wife Margaret, and their small daughter Fern, with only a team of horses, a wagon, and $5, came to Beaverhead County. And that was in 1897. And why they came here was because tragedy had struck. They were from Colorado, a town called Valmont, and fire destroyed their grain crops, and their house, and their horse barn. And then right after that, their two sons caught diphtheria, and they both passed away within 20 minutes of each other. So as you can imagine, you know, this is a family that's literally been ran through the ringer, and then they arrive in Beaverhead County. And as what had happened is when they arrived here, he had some family up at Medicine Lodge, and they located in Medicine Lodge, and he started a small ranch. Well, his small ranch, as he worked it, started to grow and grow. And it became a sheep ranch. He had some cows, but mainly sheep. And he would trail them through Medicine Lodge, and then into Dillon he'd come for supplies. And one of the interesting things was one of the trails that they would take on was Corinne Trail, which goes back to our infamous hotel. And Harry, as a gentleman, he liked to play tricks. I know as his wealth grew, one of the things he wanted to do for his wife was he wanted to get her something nice. So he, for one Christmas, they talk about how he brought this giant box out. And she would unwrap the box, and there would be like a chicken bone on top, and then another box. And then she'd have to unwrap that box, and they said there was a pig's tail in one of them. So, you know, you kind of think about it, and it's like, okay, this guy wrapped a pig's tail in his wife's present. But eventually she kind of got mad at him and started to cry, and he told her that she just needed to keep going. And inside the final box was a really nice ring. And then in 1915, he decided he was going to sell the ranch. So he sold the ranch, and is what he wanted to do is he knew that Dillon needed another hotel. And it was actually kind of a talk of the people passing through. They said the Metlen's nice, but Dillon needs something nicer. And again, this is kind of like how we talked about the dignitaries and stuff, where, you know, there was people passing through Dillon that were, you know, at that time millionaires, and they were cattle buyers and congressmen, and because you couldn't fly. So, I mean, you took the train or you took a stagecoach. And the interesting thing, too, was while I was researching this is showing a lot of the old stagecoach stops, and like Beaverhead Rock was one of them. Outside of Dillon was another one. So, I mean, as these families and these people were coming through, they needed a place to stay. So Harry took $100,000, and he took that $100,000 and he thought he's going to invest it into a new motel in the city of Dillon. So he hired an architect. The guy was out of Seattle. And also the interesting part was at this time he had sold the ranch, so his family was staying between Dillon and Seattle. And he hired an architect to design the hotel, and this was a 3-story hotel with the capability of making it a 4-story hotel in the future. So when you see the flat roof of the Andrus, that was actually designed so they could add on to it if they needed to. So in 1915, they sold the ranch. Again, he had the architect look at it. In 1916, they started putting out bids for the hotel. That was kind of one of the funny things is I was kind of looking through the papers, and one of them in the Dillon, I think this is the Dillon Examiner or something. There was a thing, new $100,000 hotel for Dillon. Now is certainly work has already started. This is kind of the interesting thing is one of the things that was kind of holding them up was that it was in February that they approved the plans and they decided they were going to build the hotel. The frost wasn't even out of the ground, and they started digging the foundation. And there were 8 large, and this kind of goes back to your talking about the how they imported Oregon pine for the Metlen. There were 8 large trees they had to chop down where the Andrus Hotel sits now. So there was pine trees in the area when they were here. And another thing, too, that is kind of an interesting kicker of trees being in the area was where William Speed used to be. That was a buggy shop. And if you ever go underneath the building, which I highly recommend you don't, some of the supports are old tree stumps.
Wow.
So there were trees in the Dillon area. So when you talked about them importing pine, they could have probably cut it here.
But, you know, I still wonder if those varieties of pine were maybe made better for construction.
Yeah, exactly. Or if ours was, you know, not fat enough to where they could get enough board feed out of cutting it that it just didn't make it worthwhile. So the construction started. And again, this was in February before the ground was even thought out. So I don't know if you've ever been in the basement of the Andrus, but I mean, I fit down there comfortably. They have a gym down there now. So that kind of gives you an idea how deep the foundation would have had to be. And so they started making the foundation. Now, the one thing, the main building would have been 115 by 75 feet. So they had to dig a hole probably 8 feet deep, 75 feet wide by 115 feet long. I'm not sure how they did it back then. You know, I know that they had dredges. I don't know if they used something kind of similar to a dredge to do that, or maybe they had steam-powered shovels. But that was how they did it. And this is the part that blew my mind, is they started digging it. Then the next thing I saw, which was only maybe 6 months after that in the paper, he had already, okay, so the hotel's 3 layers. First layer was set up to be stores and a lobby and a bar. Next layer was going to be the Andrus family had a, like, I think they called it a suite. And then it was also going to, I think it had 30 rooms on the second layer. And then the top layer was going to be permanent housing. So if somebody wanted to stay there for longer than overnight, it was basically like a you could rent out.
Bed and breakfast.
Yeah, pretty much. And like I said, within 6 months, they were already getting the plumbers in. And the plumbers were finishing up, and they were bringing in the finish workers. He already had all 5 of the lots in the downstairs, the main part. They were already rented out for businesses. And it was kind of interesting because if you looked in the paper right after they announced that, you could tell which businesses were going in there, because one of them was like $3,000 liquidation sale. And it said, "We are not going out of business. We just don't want to carry this over to the Andrus Hotel." Oh. And one of the businesses to note that was in there was Strom Jewelers. Stomp. Which...
Yeah, my great-grandfather.
Yeah. So, that was pretty interesting. And then it says the Andrus 1917. And they say that is when it opened. But I looked all through 1917, and I could not find an article that talked about the grand opening of the Andrus.
Maybe they figured that the Metlen had already outdone any grand openings, and they just figured they were. But then again, you have to look at the fact with the Metlen was basically just a hotel. This is like a complex, that's got businesses and rooms, and we'll call it bed and breakfast. It has more than just a hotel. And so maybe they just quietly opened.
Well, I think happened is I think that they might have ran into a little bit of building problems and stuff, and I don't think that they were fully open. But also that was about the time the Metlen decided they needed to update their hotel. And that was one of the things that the Andrus offered is every room had its own bathroom. Every room had its own sink. This is still to this day, this is something I always found kind of interesting was, before they remodeled the Andrus, you'd go in the bedroom and the bathroom sink was in the bedroom. Because the way the rooms were set up is you have a square pretty much. You walk in and there's a kitchen and a dining room in one, a kitchen and living room, and then you'd walk down a little hallway and there'd be a bathroom right there that would have a tub and a toilet. And then you'd walk through the next one and it would be a room that would have the bedroom, and on that back wall would be the sink for the bathroom.
Wow.
And to this day, it's still laid out that way. Dr. Micah is who now owns the hotel, and it's been completely remodeled, but he tried to keep it true to its roots. He had Donna Jones do a lot of the design work on it, and Craig Jones, and Donna and Craig are relatives of Harry Andrus. But what I did find was Hotel Andrus thrown open. That was the article for their grand opening, where the article for the grand opening for the Metlen was Gala Ceremonies mark Metlen Hotel opening. And kind of the funny part about it is this is the article for the Metlen. This little strip right here is the article for the Andrus. And this is kind of the part that I thought was really interesting is because the Metlen was $38,000 versus $100,000. Not only was the Andrus $100,000 hotel, but most people said it was more fancier than anything in New York City at the time.
Wow.
So, again, we talked about how we had the percussion band and that for the Metlen. So the Hotel Andrus, and I'm going to try to read this, and it's really small. The Hotel Andrus, Dillon's something off, now $156,499 hotel, was formally thrown open to the public last Thursday evening. The lights were turned on at 5 o'clock in the evening, and from then on, for 12 continuous hours, a great throng of people crowded the hotel lobbies and parlors to the street. So many people showed up for this. It's a big hotel. We were talking about like the Metlen, they had 70 people there, for like a party. When the Andrus opened, it was so big that the people were lined up in and out of the streets. And, it's kind of interesting because this last summer they reopened the Andrus. And, it was during Corona. And they still had a lot of people show up to walk through it. Many people had really, really interesting stories. There was actually an old guy out of Bozeman that called that remembered when he was a little kid, his dad took him there. And they gave him a free night there so he could stay on the grand opening. But I found this paper. It's a little bit easier, hopefully, to read. But it's kind of interesting because it goes on and it talks about everything that they offered, the people that showed up, some people from Virginia City, I thought I had a better article here, but it just blows my mind to think of that, because you talk about how the Metlen, when it opened, it had a band and it had everything. Then, what was it, 27 years later?
Roughly, yeah.
You have the Andrus Hotel that opens, and the Andrus Hotel was opened and built because Harry Andrus had the money, and he wanted to do something good for the community, but it was also opened because it was something that lots of people were demanding Dillon needed. And, when it opened, just a little tiny article in the Dillon Tribune, not the big fanfare, but still a huge, huge number of people showed up to look at this hotel. The interesting thing about it was not only did Harry build the hotel, but he lived in it and he managed it. So it wasn't something that he just built and left. This was a legacy that he wanted to leave there. And then it kind of goes back to like how you and I have talked about street names and stuff. If you look around Dillon, you'll see the Andrus Hotel and the Andrus Arena, but you don't really see much more about Harry. But the guy did an amazing amount of work in Dillon.
Well, yeah. We talked about the Metlen. We talked about Gus Grater, all very key builders of the early days of Dillon, and it would be nice to have them remembered. And it's just a simple thing. It's just a simple thing naming. I mean, that we have the Morses, we have a Morse Street, we have a Poindexter Street, we have an Orr Street. So, we haven't entirely lost the chance to, but there's a lot of other Dillon pioneers that really need to be remembered that way. And I'm happy the Andrus Hotel is that way, because
I mean, at one time you look at the Andrus Hotel now, and you can go into the lobby, and there's the lobby to the Andrus, and then there's Thomas Jewelers right next to it. And the Thomas Company has been there as long as I can remember. And then, it's kind of cool because now Dillon has a bow shop. We have Badger Archery in the Andrus Hotel, and the basement of the Andrus on the site that the bow shop at actually has a 20-yard indoor range. And I mean, it's crazy to think that like the history that this stuff is in and how these people have kind of made their own history. Dillon Tribune is now in the Andrus. At one time, the Dillon Tribune was probably sold out of the lobby of the Andrus. And you go into the Andrus, and then they have all the history. They have the original cash register in there from the Andrus Hotel. And they also have the original safe from the Andrus Hotel in there. And you can go into the lobby and you can look at this cash register, and you can actually, when you walk in where you could turn to the lobby or turn to the Dillon Tribune and you go back to Pioneer Furniture, the safe sits right there. Kind of another cool thing about the Andrus was they had a Great Dane called King Pharaoh. And you think of Great Danes and they're huge, huge dogs. What do you think King Pharaoh did at the Andrus?
Took beer to the people?
He would go down to the train station and grab people's bags and bring them back to the Andrus Hotel.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah,
very
sometimes he'd grab the wrong person's bags and lead them back to the hotel, and I don't know if they decide to stay there or not, but there is actually a picture of King Pharaoh when you go into the elevator of the Andrus. There's a picture of him there with like a leather harness on and two bags carrying on each side.
I'm thinking it was Harry Andrus had some great marketing techniques.
He did.
I'm going to send my dog down to get your bags, and if it does, he picks up the wrong bags, hey, why don't you check out the hotel? Well, in the 60s and into the early 70s, there was a newsstand in the lobby of the Andrus Hotel. And that was also where they dropped off the Montana Standards and the Great Falls Tribunes for the delivery boys and girls. They would meet there in the morning, get their papers, and head out. And there was an Andrus bar that was on the other side of the street. And I remembered going down there with my grandpa, Walter Stamm, and he was really good friends with Harry Andrus Jr. And they would go down there on Saturdays and play cribbage. And Guile Mitchell told me that behind the bar, there was a shelf, and it had all these cribbage boards, and they were all Harry Andrus, Walter Stamm, all these people had their own cribbage board, and they would go in there and they would they would get one glass of beer, and they would sit there and play cribbage all afternoon, and they did that for years, and Giles said he doesn't know how many, he owned the Andrus Bar for a while, and he doesn't know how many cattle deals were probably made, horse deals, business deals were made in that little lounge. And it was really kind of a cool, I'm thinking the Cheers motif.
Yeah. That was
type,
probably what you saw there, was where everybody knew their names.
Yes.
Everybody hung out. It was the place to be. And, here's kind of, it's funny because you talk about how your grandfather would go and play cribbage. And, it's funny because small town, there's always a story for something. So the Metlen Hotel was owned by the Alleys. And so I asked my mom about it. I said, how are we related to these? And she goes, the alley lady that you see at the bar, her picture was her uncle's wife. And then she's like, oh, funny story. When I was 6 years old, he had brain cancer, and he had a tumor in his head that was causing him to lose his eyesight. And he was in the Andrus Hotel on the second story because one time that was opened up. And he couldn't see where he was going, and he walked off the edge and fell down to the first story.
Wow.
So, it's funny because, small town, everybody has a story, and then you start doing this research, and then we find out these other stories, of our families and stuff. And, I always knew somehow I was related to the alley at the Metlen, but I wasn't sure the whole story. So today I asked my mom about it, and she said, well, yeah, they were married, and after he passed away, she continued to run the bar. And I think Phyllis, who owns the Metlen now, is related to that alley as well. So in a way, we're probably related through marriage as well. So it's kind of interesting because, you have, your family's roots are from when the Dillon became a town. In my family, our roots go back to a little bit later in, history. But, we had places up at French Creek and stuff like that, but these stories and these buildings, and we just see this, and it's sad to think of this lost history.
Well, that's that's one of our goals in doing this series of programs, is we want to help people learn about Dillon and this, all the little stories. It's sad that a lot of those people aren't around that we could sit down and talk. You and I talked about that when we would go visit our grandmothers and stuff, and they would be sitting around telling stories about this and stories about that, and not a tape recorder in sight.
Yeah. We would just listen, and, sad thing is my great grandma, she passed away. I think I was in 8th grade when she passed away, but I just remember her telling random stories. And at the time, I wasn't smart enough to sit down and really take it all in, and it's kind of comes down to the point, too, where I remember somebody telling me that there was a hotel brought in on the train, and I always thought it was the Metlen Hotel. Well, in a way, it kind of was. It was the Corinne where the Metlen sits now. And that's just kind of the things, as you remember from a kid, these strange stories the old timers told.
Well, and that's what we want to do, too, is we want you that are watching this, if you have heard a story or want to learn something, or think you have an idea about Southwest Montana, let us know, because it's fun to invest. I always learn more.
If you're a historian or you just know a really good story about some place and you want to come on the show and you want to be a part of it, this is your invitation.
Exactly.
Wally and I are just two guys that love history. We do our research. But we're always looking for the people that know more. Well,
the one thing that I find, you talk about doing the research, I always learn something I'm not looking for.
Yeah,
when I'm doing that. It's this little burg in southwestern Montana. It's 150 years old, something like that.
Yep.
And my goodness, is it full of history.
And the one thing I'm finding out, and it's interesting because a lot of people, they say this when you do the research, is they say Montana, especially southwestern Montana, is a very historically rich area that does not have the preservation it needs.
No. Oh, I totally agree. Well, you figure the gold discoveries in Bannock, in Virginia City, Nevada City, the copper discoveries in Butte.
Yeah.
The mines or the smelters in Anaconda, the Copper Kings, Marcus Daly, Poindexter ores, all this stuff that were the ingredients of building Montana. A lot of it started right here in our corner of southwestern Montana. I don't want to be too cocky, but I guess the cornerstone of a lot of Montana's history is right here.
Yeah, and that's what they say. They say it's a very rich in history area of Montana that's very, very neglected.
Well, maybe that's another one of our goals in bringing the history back. Maybe we excite people that want to get behind it and start doing a little bit of historical preservation.
Yep. Yeah, and again, the invitation's out there. If you guys, if you're a historian, an amateur historian, or you just know a good history tale, our door's always open.
Yep. Okay, that's going to do it for this segment of Did You Know Southwestern Montana? Once again, I'm Wally Felt. My co-host and producer-director, Jeremy Crawford. We'll see you next time.
See you later.